The research for this work came out of my doctoral dissertation, which I filed last year. I spent, all told, a couple of years in China interviewing a lot of people. I talked to about 100 people in the automobile industry, a few government people, not the senior government people, they wouldn't talk to me, but some NGO people, some association people, also some journalists. And in addition, I went through and made a pretty extensive analysis of the policy documentation regarding the automobile industry. And what comes out of this is actually a pretty interesting picture about how the Chinese do economic planning. My title, State Capitalism in China's Auto Industry, we want to look at first, just briefly, at this term state capitalism. So what is state capitalism? It's obviously a form of capitalism. We've heard this term a lot. It's been in the news quite a bit in recent years. Just a couple of weeks ago, The Economist had a great survey on it stuck in the middle. So if you're interested in state capitalism, I would really urge you to go back and read that. There was a really good debate on the website between Ian Brimmer and some other people, and a good learning opportunity. But to try to boil it down, obviously China is not the only country that uses this form of capitalism. Other countries do. Certainly the oil kingdoms, Mexico gets thrown in there, Brazil, India. So it's not that unusual across the world, but each country has sort of its own brand, and China has a kind of state capitalism that works within China's institutions. But the way it sort of works is ruling elites in a country have opened to the market because they see value in that, but at the same time they want to sort of keep some boundaries around the influence of the market, mostly because they fear chaos or they fear a risk to the rule of a ruling party. And so they love the impact of markets, but they want to sort of limit that. The way we see this manifest itself is in heavy state ownership of enterprises, in detailed economic planning, resource nationalism, sovereign wealth funds. In China, the question, does it work? I think, well, just briefly, let's look at the results. Over the past 30 years, China's economy has grown about 10% a year on average. It would be really difficult to argue that it hasn't worked in China, assuming you buy the idea that what we witness in China is called state capitalism. You could probably argue that it doesn't work, but you would have to argue a counterfactual that something else would have worked better, and it's hard to imagine what could have worked better. This is unprecedented in human history. The how does it work is what I'm going to talk about today. And what it means for us is simply something, I guess, for all of us to sort of keep in mind. And I'll talk a bit about that as I wrap up toward the end. So there are a couple of questions that motivated my study. The first being, if state ownership is so bad, why does China seem to be doing so well with it? We here in the West have sort of grown up with this idea that, yes, the government has its place, but in the economy, it shouldn't be too much. We don't mind that the government has some influence, and there are debates over how much that should be. But when you start talking about the extent to which China's government is involved, there are huge debates over that. And in the West, we tend to think, well, even when General Motors was rescued by the US government, many Americans were extremely unhappy that the state intervened to save a major company. The second question, and I think this is a really fascinating question to me, is China breaking the rules of capitalism, or are they rewriting them? The implications of this are pretty serious. If they're breaking the rules, then that implies that at some point there's a price to pay. And that the way China has been running its economy, at some point those chickens will come home to roost. But if China is rewriting the rules, that is, if China has come up with this nice magical formula that combines markets with state control, then the implications for us in the West are, how do we compete with that? How do we compete with that if we wish to have a much smaller intervention by the state. So now what I have done is I have compared, or I've looked at the Chinese automobile industry. This is sort of a micro study where I look at a single industry, but I'm looking for general principles that describe how China plans its economy. But briefly, just why the auto industry of all industries? Back in 2008, when I was scratching my head over what to write for a dissertation, and I was thinking about these sorts of issues, I thought about which industries seemed to be interesting and would present an interesting enough set of case studies that I could look at. I don't really know much about steel or copper or coal. These are not things I buy. I've bought a few cars. I drive cars. I kind of get that industry. And so that seemed interesting. And as I looked at it, I found the interesting thing about this industry in China is there are a number of ownership types in this industry, including state ownership, private ownership, joint ventures with foreigners. And these varieties of ownership appeared to me to present enough variance that I could look at how interaction works between the players in the industry. And what we're looking at here is just a picture. The metric I'm using is thousands of passenger cars produced per dollar of individual wealth. The denominator there is GDP per capita, and it's in 1990 dollars across the board. So we have a common denominator. There's no currency effect here. I'm looking at 3 countries: the United States, Japan, Korea, and China. There are, of course, many other countries that have auto industries, but to keep the picture simple, you can see how the United States started at the beginning of the 20th century, ramped up slowly, and with the exception of a few dips around world wars and Great Depression, began to turn downward in the 1950s as the Japanese began to ramp up their auto industry. And then in the 1980s, the Japanese began to stagnate as the United States asks them to have voluntary export restraints of their vehicles to the United States. I should also point out here, Japanese cars made in the United States are in the US figures. They're not in the Japanese figures. And then around that time, the Korean, the green line begins to ramp up. And my sense is here, because Japan is a little bit smaller than the United States, Korea is a lot smaller, the potential for these industries is somewhat smaller, a smaller area, a smaller population. China launched its passenger car industry in earnest in the early to mid 80s. And like the others, a slow ramp up until suddenly in the early 2000s, something happened. Does anybody want to take a guess? 2001, 2002, what happened in China? WTO membership. With membership in WTO, the high tariffs on cars were suddenly going to be phased out. The Chinese automakers all began to compete very heavily on price, destroying their own margins. But in the process, the prices of cars came down really fast, and suddenly millions and millions of middle-class Chinese could afford cars, and sales took off. Now, when I first started looking at this data, that final segment where they're literally climbing the wall hadn't happened yet. And so I was just looking at those last 2 dots, which actually is 2007 and 2008 kind of overlap. And what that told me is maybe China's beginning to stagnate. Well, of course, 2009 happened, which blew that theory out of the water. And since then, it's gone up a little bit more, although I haven't loaded in the 2011 data. My sense is it probably has come down a bit. But anyway, you get an idea that China's auto industry is growing tremendously. It's worth looking at. But if it's not doing so profitably, then you could say, well, it's not sustainable. We can move on and look at something else. Well, it is profitable. Combined industry profits are also climbing. And we may question the veracity of these numbers. I certainly would. But you cut the profits in half, they're still growing. One more thing about the Chinese auto industry I want to point out here is the 3 that are shaded in blue at the bottom. These 3 are private companies. And this is one thing that's unusual about China. Neoclassical economic theory tells us these guys shouldn't be here. When the government is the largest investor in an industry, it should drive out private investment. Who wants to compete with a government who has permission to print currency, essentially? That's tough. And we'll look more at that in a bit as to why these private automakers are there. And you've heard of some of these, probably, if you've read the news, BYD, Geely, which Clay has mentioned, and the Great Wall. Now, these are 5 arguments that came out of my study and that drive the book which I have coming out. I call them macro arguments because these are arguments about how China does planning from a macro level. As I go through the presentation, you'll see things that apply only to the auto industry, but it'll be pretty apparent, and you can even ask yourself which of these things also matter from a more of a macro perspective. And what I want to point out here is I'm not going to be able to go in depth in all of these. It required me an entire book to do this, but I will touch on all of these. And these sort of flow from one to the next. Starting at the top, politics trumps economics in policy conflicts. The example you're going to see is that the central government has its own objectives in terms of how it wants this industry run. But there are some conflicts there. And you'll see when push comes to shove how the central government will prefer social stability over a competitive industry. We'll see that in a few moments. Next is that the central government demonstrates flexibility and adaptability. And this is illustrated in the fact that China's central government has a lot of balls in the air, has a lot of competing priorities that it's attempting to balance. And time after time, they don't mind if rules get broken. And in fact, we see that sometimes the central government itself will step in and say, you're breaking the rule. Oh, and let us suggest a way to help you out, to help you continue doing what you're doing so that you aren't so blatantly breaking the rules. Number 3 may be considered somewhat controversial depending on who you talk to, that the central government still wields most of the power. We've seen a lot of scholarship since the 80s, particularly with fiscal decentralization in China, that a lot of the power has been pushed down to the local levels along with fiscal responsibilities. And some pretty compelling scholarship lays out these theses. You also see scholarship on the other end of that saying, oh no, the central government maintains complete power. It's a totalitarian system. The central government, single party rule, they have all the power. The reality is more subtle. It's somewhere in between. And I'll make a few observations that sort of lay that out. Number 4, state involvement in the economy is detrimental to innovation. This sort of goes back to the thesis from neoclassical economics. We'll see that in a bit, particularly as it concerns private companies. These are the real innovators. And finally, foreign firms pay a price in terms of intellectual property. This is increasingly the case for a foreign company that goes into China. You get access to the market, but it's not free. Now, the way I wanted to go through this is in terms of a model. And the model looks at all of the players in the industry: central government, local government, SOEs, which are state-owned enterprises, private firms, foreign multinational corporations. And I've drawn in arrows here showing a principal-agent relationship. The principal-agent relationship basically says the principal has things it wants done and the agent is responsible for carrying those things out. An analogy, in a corporation you have shareholders who are the principals. They hire managers to run the company, and they expect those managers to do things on their behalf. But very often the agent, or those managers, benefits from what's called information asymmetry, which is simply a fancy way of saying they know things that the principal doesn't know, and they can behave in ways that are contrary to the principal's interests. So we'll see evidence of that. I'm going to go through each of these 5, and I'm going to apologize right now for the number of words on this slide. But let me explain how this works. For each of these 5, I'm just going to tell you who they are, what their goals and objectives are, And then the instruments, basically how it is they try to get what they want, the tools that they have in their toolkit. Also, I want to point out here that I talk in terms of goals and objectives, which are two different things. It's a subtle difference. A goal is it's hard, it's difficult to change. An objective is a little more changeable, and it supports achievement of a goal. So think of it in terms of that, in that way. The goal is difficult to change, and the objective may be changed, but the purpose of the objective is to achieve the goal. So central government, we're talking primarily about the NDRC, which is the economic planner in China, and MIIT, which is the regulator of all industry, which includes the auto industry. We also should mention the party state, because in this sense, the senior leaders of the Communist Party are also the senior leaders of the government. So they are one and the same. The overarching goal, then, of the party state is regime survival, that the Communist Party continue to rule in China. And the objectives that support that, no surprise here, economic growth, social stability. But then for the auto industry specifically, they have a goal which is to have a domestically dominant and globally competitive auto industry. They haven't achieved either of those yet, but they're headed in that direction. And then there are 4 objectives that support that goal for the auto industry. And these 4 objectives I will describe in much more detail later as we set this model into motion. This is how we will assess how this model is performing. But it's consolidation, technology acquisition, development of Chinese brands, and new energy vehicles. And finally, the instruments, no big surprises here. The central government can make policy. They have power over personnel appointments. If you want to get promoted, you must please your superiors. This is probably the most potent and powerful tool that they have. Industry protection, which you could call trade protection of China from outside. Funding, the central government controls the big banks. If you want funding, that's where you get your funding. Foreign approvals, if you want to do business in China, you depend upon the central government for that approval. Next, we'll look at local government. These are local, state, and party leaders, and this is all levels of government below central, so provincial, city, county, and so forth. Here we talk about the party leaders because these are the ones who determine how the local government runs. What do they want? They want promotion. It's plain and simple. They want to move up in the hierarchy, and they have several objectives that help them to do that. The first 2 are just like the central government: economic growth, social stability. They also have fiscal concerns as expenses continue to be pushed down and tax collection continues to be pulled up. That places pressure on them. Also local prestige, which is simply we want to look better than, Shanghai would like to look better than Guangzhou. This is sort of a natural way. The better you look compared to your competitors, the more likely you get promoted. The instruments they use, these are self-explanatory as well. They control, local governments control access to land. They can give tax breaks. They can give breaks on utilities. They have control over local funding access. Local protectionism, they might place a tax on a car built in a neighboring province. If you want to buy it there and drive it in, you're going to pay a tax there. They can lobby the central government on behalf of a business, which can be a powerful tool depending on how the relationship between local leaders and the central government is. And finally, shirking. And this is sort of the English way of saying the 上有政策,下有对策. This is the principal-agent relationship. The agent can shirk his duty by either not carrying out policy or carrying it out to a lesser degree. State-owned enterprises are the next player. And here we're talking about the leaders of central state-owned enterprises and local state-owned enterprises. The same goal here is for promotion. They want to move up. And what's interesting about these guys is these positions as leaders of SOEs are inherently political positions. Many of these people have come from a government or party position, and when they finish, they will return to a government or party position. This is quite common. And so they have the kinds of objectives that would help to work in their favor. The sorts of things that they are concerned about are profitability. You can't lose money. They want to employ a lot of people because that contributes to social stability, which again, we've seen those goals of both local governments and the central government. Size, this is written into policy. The Chinese automobile policy says we want the larger among our automobile companies to move up on the Fortune 500 global ranking. It says Fortune 500 in Chinese policy, which reflects this curious fascination with lists compiled by foreigners that I don't understand, but it's there and it's important. And finally, minimal risk. They're not big risk takers, which if you don't take a lot of risk, you don't gain a lot of return. But it's because they want to avoid loss. Political cycles in China run about 5 years. And in 5 years, the leader of an SOE is looking for that next position. Maybe he'll become a vice governor or a vice minister, or he may run an association. He has a short-term investment horizon. So he's not going to invest a lot of money in research and development that won't pay off until after he's gone. That only helps the next guy. So they tend to think in very short terms. The instruments that they have at their disposal are employment. They employ a lot of people, and this is a bargaining chip they have with local governments. They generate tax revenue, likewise, and also shirking, because as agents of either local government or central government, they can choose to carry out policy or not. Private enterprises. These are entrepreneurs. Their goals are survival and profitability. And there's really kind of a Maslow hierarchy here, if you think about it this way. Survival is the number one goal. You're not so concerned about profitability unless you can just simply keep your head above water. But profitability also becomes an objective that supports that lower level goal. And eventually, profitability in itself becomes a goal. A little complicated. Certainly feel free to ask me questions about that later if you'd like. But here it's about living to see the next day. So you've got to have the kind of scale. You've got to produce enough cars to make money. You've got to do so profitably. You have to innovate. And this is one of the unique things about the private sector. The state-owned enterprises, they get this tremendous benefit, which is they can partner up with foreign automakers that come into China. Foreign automakers bring their technology, they bring their designs, they bring assembly know-how. The Chinese side contributes some land, a factory, and workers. The investment, the heavy lifting, is done by the foreigners. The SOE sits back and makes easy money by selling foreign-branded cars. The private enterprises don't have that benefit. They don't get to partner with the foreigners. They've got to innovate on their own. They don't get the funding from the state-owned banks. They have to worry about controlling their assets. They have to worry about expropriation. And this last one, the level playing field, really more of a hope than an objective. They really would like to have a level playing field with the SOEs. They don't have it. Their instruments are, the first three are similar: employment, tax revenue, and shirking. The last two are the most powerful bargaining chips the private sector has. Innovation, which I talked about, and Chinese brands. The only brands the private sector produces are Chinese brands because they're not partnering with foreign automakers. Finally, the foreigners, the multinational corporations. These are established global players: GM, Toyota, Hyundai, Mercedes. Their main goal is shareholder returns, and they do this in a couple of ways. And this speaks specifically to their goals for China. First of all, profitability, which improves the shareholder returns, but also it's a matter of protecting their assets, of not allowing their intellectual property to be taken or stolen or coerced or pried from their hands in some way, because these are the assets of their shareholders who've invested billions of dollars in development of these assets. So you want to make money, but you want to be careful about how much you give away in terms of intellectual property. They have the same three instruments at the top: employment, tax revenue, shirking. What they bring to the table, as I mentioned before, is technology that they contribute to joint ventures and cash. The SOEs make a ton of cash off of selling foreign branded vehicles. And finally, a WTO mechanism, which if there are trade issues, they can urge their home governments to bring charges. So next I'm going to sort of set the model in motion and see how things work. And I'm going to talk in terms of the 4 auto industry objectives that were listed on the first page when I was talking about the central government. These are the central government's 4 objectives. And I'll talk about each 4 of these in turn. Consolidation. What's consolidation all about? Well, first you have to look at the state of the industry, and it's heavily fragmented. There are a lot of players in the industry, and many of them are very small. This is one of the oldest objectives. This was written into policy back in the 1980s, and you can see why. Just as China was beginning to get interested in an automobile industry, as Deng Xiaoping's reforms were getting underway, there were already 58 assemblers of automobiles. This doesn't include component manufacturing. These are assemblers of finished automobiles, 58 in a single country in 1982. 3 years later, it doubled to 114. So there's no question that this is a huge problem for China's auto industry, and the central government has a great interest in shrinking down that number. And here's how they've done it. I'll just go through some of these quickly. They have these consolidation formulas that come out occasionally. Back in the 80s, it was big 3, small 3. The most recent is big 4, small 4, which is just simply these 4 really big automakers, we will encourage them to conduct nationwide mergers to get bigger. These 4 small, which aren't really small, they're still among the top 10, but they're smaller than the big 4. We encourage them to conduct regional mergers to get bigger. And all you others, we want you to combine with these guys. The central government often throws up barriers to entry. Back in the early to mid 90s, it was simply a moratorium on formation of new automobile companies. And at that time, the number of automobile companies did stay steady. There weren't any new ones formed. Also, there's one that I would call the BYD rule, which is BYD is a company that actually has a headquarters here in Los Angeles, you may have heard of. They are best known for electric automobiles. But when they were first built, when they were first formed, they were a battery company. They made batteries for laptops and eventually cell phones. And their leader, Wang Chuanfu, decided, we could take these batteries and we could put them in a car and have electric cars. And that would be really cool. And it would save the environment. And he was really ahead of his time in this thinking. And so what he did was in 2003, went out and bought a bankrupt state-owned auto company. Well, once that horse had escaped the barn, China came along and closed the door and said, you can't do that anymore. If a company goes bankrupt, its license to produce automobiles can only be bought by another automobile company. Finally, mergers. The government wants to see mergers and wants to encourage them. It prefers that the market drive these mergers rather than going along and forcing auto companies to get together. It prefers that the market do it. But the government has also said, look, we want this to happen, but we will step in, we will take measures if we need to, which is sort of a warning that you guys need to merge, right? And these are some of the ways the central government has done it. So what kind of progress have we seen? Actually, pretty good if you look at the top of the industry. Top 5 companies, the top 5 companies in the United States have a combined market share of 70.8%. The top 5 in China have 70.4%. And China's biggest company, which is Shanghai Auto, has a bigger market share than the US's biggest company, which is General Motors. So based on this, they must be doing pretty well. But what about at the bottom? What about below these 5? United States, we have another couple of dozen or so. All the big automakers build cars and sell cars in the US. In China, there's still 110. So in 1985, there were 114. Now there are 115. The number's kind of gone up and down since then, so it's only coincidental. But these 110,000, and actually this is old data, they now employ closer to 300,000 people. This is huge. Nothing has been done. In nearly 3 decades of a policy demanding consolidation, not a lot has happened. Why? Well, we could say the central government just simply doesn't have the clout, can't make it happen. And it's resulted in an industry that's essentially bifurcated. You've got the top 10, which have approaching 90%, and then all the rest, which are very tiny. Why is this? What we have is contradictory objectives, and I'll explain how this works. Local governments have incentives to drive economic growth and social stability in their local regions. This is what drives promotion among local state leaders. They are disinclined to want to close any kind of company that employs anybody. Adding to your unemployment problem is not a way to get promoted. Well, the central government has all these tools which we saw. Policy pronouncements. They have power over personnel. So why doesn't the central government just step in and say, okay, you guys need to shut all of these small, unproductive, inefficient, unprofitable automakers? Because the central government also has the same incentives or the same goal, which is social stability. And we see this repeatedly. When push comes to shove, social stability wins out over development of a competitive industry. So you can't make the argument that the central government is not getting what it wants. If it got either of these, it would be getting what it wants. But the repeated behavior of the central government tell us what it wants more. And what it wants more is social stability. Now we'll move to the next objective, which is technology acquisition. Who cares about technology acquisition? Why not just rely on the foreigners to keep bringing in technology, and we can make the cars and make lots of money? The problem with that is 50% of the profits of every car made with a foreign brand in China goes right back out of China, goes back into the pockets of the foreign automaker. They own the technology, and the Chinese, if they are legally using that technology, pay royalties for the use of it. But the way the model used to work, beginning in the 80s, was the Chinese automaker provides access to the foreign automaker who provides technology to the Chinese automaker. That was the original plan that was envisioned. And the way this would work is the Chinese would eventually no longer need the foreigners because they would have the technology. They would know how to build cars. Unfortunately, that never really worked out. And the government, the central government, over years, over the next 2 decades, became increasingly detailed about what it wanted in terms of technology. But something then happened to get in the way. WTO membership. When the Chinese agreed to join the WTO, part of the agreement there was that you can no longer require a foreign company to hand over technology in exchange for approval of foreign investment. So the Chinese then kicked out all of the foreigners and no longer allowed any more foreigners, and then began to make Chinese brands. No. They ran into a wall and they found a way around. They had to come up with a more creative way to get their hands on the technology. This particular objective overlaps with the next one, which is Chinese brand development, and then these two will come together, and I'll show you how this works and how China's government has come up with a pretty creative way to deal with this. Chinese brand development works the same way as acquisition of technology. Whoever's name is on it, wherever it originates, they get most of the money. And so the Chinese are obviously concerned about the brands that are on cars sold in China. They would prefer that they be Chinese brands. These are the same 5 companies that I showed you earlier with their cumulative market shares, and then now I've just put in the names of the companies and broken out their individual. On the US side, what these companies have in common, GM, Ford, Toyota, Honda, Chrysler, is they make cars with their brands on them. What about the Chinese companies? Shanghai Auto, they make mostly GM cars and Volkswagens. Dongfeng makes mostly Nissan and Citroen. First Auto Works makes mostly Toyota and Mazda and Volkswagen. Chang'an makes mostly Ford and Suzuki and Mazda and Peugeot. Beijing Auto makes mostly Mercedes, and Hyundai. Now, these companies do also make some cars under their own brands, and the quality of their own brands is improving. But still, as of today, more than 70% of the cars sold in China have a foreign brand on them. And in 2011, the percentage of Chinese branded cars actually declined. It went from 31% down to 29%. So Chinese brands actually lost ground in 2011, which was a big surprise because it wasn't supposed to happen that way. Now, this is the creative method I was talking about, and here's where we see technology and brands come together. I call this JV brands. Some people call them sub-brands. There are a number of, I don't think the industry has really decided on a proper name for this technology. Let me walk you through this. The first column is exactly what you would think. Their imports, the technology, the brand, and where it's built are all outside China. The far end, column 4, all Chinese. This was all that was available to Chinese at the beginning of the 80s. Although not a lot of exports, not a lot of imports even at that time, and they were extremely expensive. As foreign multinationals were invited in to partner with the Chinese SOEs, we get column number 2. You get foreign technology and a foreign brand, but it's built in China. And to this day, these are the 70% of the cars that are sold in China. Column 3 is fairly new. It was just recently introduced in the past 2 to 3 years. And it just adds one more zhong in there, which you've got foreign technology still, but it has a Chinese brand and it's made in China. And there are a couple of reasons for this. First is a little bit less money would flow out of China because it doesn't have a foreign name on it. Also, they're trying to bridge a perception gap. Chinese consumers believe the best cars are in column 2. They believe they're superior to the cars in column 4. That's a pretty universal belief in China. Not always universally the case, I must say, but this is sort of the perception of consumers in China. And this is sort of intended to bridge that gap. Now, what was creative about this is that starting a couple of years ago, and this is attested to by senior executives of foreign automakers who've had to deal with these negotiations. Starting a couple of years ago, when a foreign automaker would come to Beijing and say, we want to start a new joint venture or build a new factory or expand an existing factory, we need permission, please. They found that their requests were sort of ignored. And what they ultimately began to realize is the central government was waiting for them to voluntarily put on the table a plan to help their Chinese partners develop Chinese brands. And so now this is the only way you get approvals for expansion is by offering to help your Chinese, by volunteering to help your Chinese partner develop Chinese brands. So this is the sort of the creative way that they've begun to get around this. You might argue they are violating the spirit of the WTO ruling, but certainly not the letter of the law, possibly. Here's some examples of that. This car looks like a Honda Civic, or the City, which it's called in Asia. This technology was essentially handed over to Guangzhou Auto by its partner Honda. This is an older model of a Buick Excel, which was handed to Shanghai Auto, Shanghai GM Wuling. It's now called the Baojun. Now these particular cars, whether they were coerced in handing over the technology or not, the designs were legally obtained. No one says that this is anything illegal. No one is claiming that the foreign companies have been ripped off. There was an agreement that took place for the transfers of technology. But there have been some illicit acquisition of technology, or allegedly illicit. Here in 2003, Toyota filed a lawsuit against Geely, which came up with a logo very similar to its own. And in a precedent-setting ruling, the judge said, this is not a well-known brand in China which deserves protection. And all of the foreign automakers had been kind of watching this this trial in the hopes that they would be able to see, yes, China is indeed serious about protecting our intellectual property. Unfortunately, the ruling led to some pretty wholesale copying. Geely is making a Mercedes look-alike. Beijing Auto is making a Jeep Cherokee look-alike. Jack Auto is making a really nice knockoff of the Ford F-150 pickup. Great Wall is making a spitting image of the Toyota Yaris. Li Fan's making a Mini Cooper look-alike. Chery has made a QQ, which looks very much like the Chevy Spark. Now, these are older model cars, and there's an interesting story behind the copying that went on between these two. And if you're very interested, ask me about it in the Q&A or afterward. Or you can buy my book. I've got the whole thing laid out in there. Or you can buy Mike Dunn's book about General Motors in China. It's in there as well. The final objective I want to look at, and I'll just look at this very briefly, is new energy vehicles. I refer to these as NEVs, just for short. They're called 新能源汽车, which is new energy vehicles, literally. And it's all about hybrids and electric vehicles, about preserving the environment, about saving energy. BYD is one of the most well-known companies in China for this kind of vehicle. On the left here, we see the F3DM, which was the world's first production plug-in hybrid. Looks an awful lot like an older model Toyota Corolla, which BYD freely admits. They did copy the Corolla. On the right, Warren Buffett, who's very well known to us, not just us, but also the Chinese know who this guy is as well. High-profile investor. He came in early in 2008 and announced he was buying 10% of BYD. And that was sort of a signal to the market that this is really going somewhere. And BYD's stock went through the roof and subsequently returned to earth. He's still sitting on a little bit of a profit, but not as big as it was. But China had a lot of plans for these particular kinds of vehicles. They wanted to see a really big ramp up in capacity. The feeling was, we're kind of behind in this internal combustion engine technology that the foreigners have all of this advantage in. They've been building those kinds of engines and technology for 100 years, some of them. This is new. This is an opportunity to sort of leapfrog and to be on a level playing field with the foreign automakers who are also just sort of feeling around and experimenting with new energy vehicles. And a number of policies were made. Right now, there are 6 cities in China that are considered to be pilot cities. And if you are lucky enough to live in one of those cities, as a consumer, you get a subsidy if you buy one of these kinds of vehicles. But it's only 6 cities so far. There are also charging stations that are going in for electric vehicles.
What are the 6 cities?
Beijing, Shanghai, Hangzhou.
Is it in your book?
It is.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
I'll find it.
Okay. Some of them were actually a surprise. I want to say Hefei. I wouldn't have expected. But there have been some problems. This is an electric taxi that caught on fire in Hangzhou and was on all of the news in China. Not really good PR for the industry. These have similar problems as laptops. You remember a few years ago, Sony laptops were catching on fire. These lithium-ion batteries. Producing a stable battery is actually much harder than you would expect. BYD has probably made the most advances with batteries because they started as a battery company. But even they are having difficulties having both the quality that's necessary and getting the price down to a price point that consumers can afford. As I said before, there was a goal this was set back in 2009. By the end of 2011, we want to have 500,000 capacity of new energy vehicles in China. Last year, they sold 8,000. Now, that shouldn't be that big of a surprise. The electric vehicle or the hybrid vehicle, like in the United States, is still not a very good value proposition. People you see driving Priuses, and some of you very well may, you're paying more than you had to for the car. You're paying for the nice, interesting, socially conscious technology, which is a good thing, and we appreciate the positive externalities of what you're doing. But you're taking a hit. Chinese consumers get this. They understand it's not a really good value, and so it hasn't caught on in China. And of course, in LA, we see a lot of these vehicles. You go to other parts of the US, you don't see as many Priuses as you do here. So this is sort of still in its nascent stage. This is the newest of all of the objectives. And the previous three objectives about consolidation, technology acquisition, and Chinese brand development were seen as solutions to problems that existed. This was about trying to get out ahead of the curve. So it's still nascent. It still remains to be seen whether Chinese manufacturers have any kind of an advantage to offer. This is the final slide, and I'll just go through this really quickly, and then we'll open up for questions. The things I want to point out here are, first of all, there are implications for China's private sector. And now the central government has begun to appreciate what the private sector brings to the industry. They understand the fact that the incentives faced by the private players helps them to be innovators. It helps them to build Chinese brands. It's the only way they can survive. The central government also understands that the incentives given to the state-owned enterprises are essentially disincentives to innovation and to Chinese brands. Now the SOEs are all building Chinese brands, but their hearts aren't in it, and you can tell because the money is not going in that direction to the degree that it should be. And the insistence on continued state control of the economy is what keeps things the way they are. Also, we've seen in other industries, the coal industry and the steel industry, for example, private companies there have been taken over by state-owned enterprises. And so it's a legitimate concern, it should be a legitimate concern of private automakers as to how safe their assets are. The lack of an independent judiciary should give them pause for thought. Yet they're still there, which to me is still a genuine puzzle. These guys are determined to build cars, and they're going head-to-head with the government. I think a lot more, this is a really interesting area for research, getting at the motivations of entrepreneurs in China, why they go against the government when they could pick a different industry. If they have enough money, they could immigrate. They could go to another place. Yet they stay and they compete. My sense is nationalism probably has something to do with that. Pride has something to do with that. And this also leads to the question, since the private sector are the ones that are doing the innovation, and they continue to be sort of pushed down and victims of an unlevel playing field, can China then innovate? Does China have the ability to innovate under its current system? First, I think, it's fun to see how Chinese cars are spitting images of foreign cars, but the reality is China, at its stage of development right now, isn't doing anything that everybody else didn't do before. At the end of the Industrial Revolution, or during the Industrial Revolution, the Germans saw what the British were doing and they copied them. The Americans came along and copied the Germans and the British. Eventually the Japanese came along. They copied the Americans and the Germans and the British. And now the Chinese are copying the Japanese and the Americans and the Germans and the British. And so from the Chinese perspective, all this yelling and screaming about intellectual property doesn't make a lot of sense. It's simply unfortunate for China that China has reached this stage of development at the time that international institutions are so robust. They weren't before. We now have the WTO, and for China, in many ways, it's turned out to be a bit of a double-edged sword. It's given China a lot of benefits, but it's also caused China a lot of headaches. And the question of whether China can innovate going forward, I think, really goes toward whether the state is going to be willing to open up and allow the private sector to work its magic. That remains to be seen. It's difficult for a single-party state to let go of that kind of control, to allow the market to work its magic untethered, because that's unknown, it's uncontrollable, and who knows what could happen. The implications here, I think, for the foreign manufacturers are a little bit clearer. If you assume the Chinese will never be able to innovate, which I don't think you can, but if we go there, if the Chinese are only able to copy more and better and faster, which they are doing, what does that mean for the foreign multinationals? That means that anything they spend billions of dollars to invent or to develop gets copied faster, gets brought to market more quickly. And so this, I think, for the foreign multinationals has pretty serious consequences. If you're going into China, you can't simply go into China and say, well, we have the WTO and that protects our IP. You're kidding yourself if you think that's going to happen. Foreign manufacturers have to understand, if your IP is valuable to you, and indeed it is to all of them, you can't simply trust your partner. You've got to truly keep a clamp on that intellectual property. The foreign executives I talked to said, your technology bleeds. When you go to China, your technology bleeds. It goes out of your pocket, and no matter what anybody says, they are copying your stuff. So if you can put your technology into a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, that's better. Unfortunately for automakers, they can't do that. They have no choice but to partner with Chinese automakers. And that's the brilliance of this rule from Beijing, which is if they're going to be here, they're going to be bringing something to the table in China. What about growth potential in this industry? And we're almost done. In 2009, the United States had 439 cars per 1,000 people. China had 35. So, wow, it's going to grow and it's not going to stop until it hits a US level, right? Well, if you've been to Beijing recently, you know that's not true. You know that's not going to happen. Those ring roads are virtual parking lots during the day. The pollution is pretty bad. I'm getting ready to go over there in April for the Beijing Auto Show, and you know, I usually, it takes me a while to recover a bit when I return from Beijing. It has a noticeable effect on your health. And to the extent that big cities like Beijing are limiting automobile ownership. I think in Beijing it's limited to 250,000 new cars hit the road a year. Before that it was unlimited. So the growth potential is not as great as we would think. At some point, and you got to figure it's below that American level of 439 per 1,000. We don't know where that ceiling is, but at some point it's got to slow down. Beijing's subway system is outstanding. When I go there, I don't bother with taxis anymore. You can get everywhere faster underground. So there are alternatives, and at least in terms of urban planning, they're thinking ahead and providing those alternatives. But again, for the foreign multinationals, that means don't expect to put a car in every driveway in China. Finally, talking about state capitalism. China's government has done a pretty good job of taking an industry that didn't exist and making it the largest in the world. China now sells over 18 million cars a year. It is the largest automobile market in the world. The government made that happen with brute force. Now, it's not everything has gone their way. A lot of the technology still originates overseas. The brands, many still originate overseas. So you have to begin to ask yourself, this state capitalism thing, is there sort of a time limit out there? And this is a great place for research, I think. I don't think this has been adequately researched, but these are the kinds of questions people are asking. Is there a point at which the state should say, all right, we've done all we can. We've applied all of the competencies we bring to the table. It's time to step back and maybe to build in a mechanism where they gradually extricate themselves from the economy. The only problem with that is governments don't like to give up power. No governments like to give up power. The United States government does not like to give up power. When you create a program in this country, it doesn't go away. It's even more difficult in China because at least in the US, there's an opposition party that's yelling and screaming saying we need to get the government out. Not that they're completely correct either, but there's at least a debate that goes on. There is a debate going on in China, but there isn't an opposition party. Fortunately, the debate is taking place. The question is there any kind of a mechanism China can put in place to decide when and where is the appropriate time to step back? That's a very difficult question to answer. I don't think we're going to see it soon. And with that, I will end the presentation.